In recent decades, China's rapid economic growth has been making headlines around the world. However, one area in which China's growth has been less rapid has been in that of its population. As of May 2023, China lost its top spot as the world's most populous country to India. Part of the reason for this can be explained by the so-called one-child policy enacted in 1979 and ultimately abolished in 2015. But what was the one-child policy? How did it affect Chinese society? And why was it ultimately abandoned? You're listening to Talking History. My name is Djene and Patrick.
And I'm Patrick Needham. Joining us to answer these questions is Dr. Sarah Mellors-Rodriguez, a historian of modern China based here in Missouri State University. She is also author of Reproductive Realities in Modern China, 1911 to 2021, which was published earlier this year by Cambridge University Press, a book which charts the history of Chinese efforts to regulate population growth, including the history of the one-child policy. Dr. Sarah Mellors-Rodriguez, welcome to Talking History.
Thank you for having me here today.
I would like to begin by asking you about the origins of the one-child policy. China's Communist Party took over in 1949, but the one-child policy was adopted 3 decades later in 1979. What explains this apparent shift in Chinese policy?
So the origins of the one-child policy lie in changing ideas about the relationship between economic growth and population. So initially in the early 1950s, there was a belief that the larger the population is, there's naturally going to be a larger workforce. And the idea was that many hands make light work. So if there is a huge population, there's going to be an equally huge and effective workforce. That line of thinking quickly went out of style when it was found to produce labor inefficiency, and it also didn't align with the realities of food making. So there were already food shortages in the early 1950s, so having unmitigated population growth didn't make sense. Moreover, birth control, when it was permitted, initially it was more or less completely banned, and when it was permitted, it was only allowed for increasing the spacing between births. So with the goal of improving maternal and infant health, not for actually curbing population growth. The 1953 census was the first census of the People's Republic of China, and it brought to the attention of political elites the fact that the country was growing at an unprecedented rate. So something like 60 million people had been born in a short number of years, which is something that probably should have been anticipated, but it wasn't. And that kind of changed the conversation about the relationship between population and growing the nation and the economy.
So we talk about the one-child policy in a general sense, but it really isn't a single policy. Can you outline perhaps what these policy measures were and perhaps how the one-child policy developed over time? Was there a shift in the way that it was implemented in, for example, the 80s and the 90s? Because this was a more than 3 decade long project. Can you kind of give us an overview of what this rubric of a one-child policy meant in practice and how it changed over time?
Yeah, definitely. So in the United States, we tend to use the term family planning when referring to the use of birth control. But in China, the term is a little bit more specific and perhaps more aggressive. It's called birth planning, 计划生育, planned births. So birth planning was introduced first in the 1950s, again, after this census revealed that there were just too many births, and also that women weren't participating enough in the workforce because they were having, successive births and not having time to contribute to state building. So birth planning was initially incorporated into the national scene in the mid-1950s, but it was very much contested. There were repeated debates among elites and between elites and local power holders through the 1950s and 60s. And this explains why so many of the birth planning policies were ineffective, because they were highly self-contradictory. Also, there was really no infrastructure in place to make sure that people were given access to family planning measures. So even if on paper they were legally allowed to use birth control, in reality, finding birth control that was reliable was much more difficult. In the 1960s, after there's this movement called the Great Leap Forward, which was essentially a 3-year period in which the PRC, the People's Republic of China, tries to expedite its growth from a very kind of limited state of industrialization to it wants to actually take on the UK and the West in terms of economic development in just 3 years. This is a massive failure with a huge loss of life. It's considered to be the world's greatest man-made loss of life, with between 30 million and 100 million deaths, depending on who you ask. Anyway, with the end of this man-made famine that was produced by the Great Leap Forward, it becomes increasingly obvious that China really just doesn't have enough food to support its people, and people are disillusioned with the existing policy. So now in the mid-1960s, there's an increasing emphasis on birth planning and on wanhun, which is delaying marriage. The idea is that people don't have sex until marriage, so if you can get them to put off getting married, then they will put off having sex, which means the number of years that they're able to reproduce for is more limited.
So they had a kind of abstinence program for Americans listeners, something that we may be familiar with.
And funny enough, this kind of abstinence program and abstinence education is kind of the standard still today in mainland China. So moving into the 1970s, there's another period of great chaos, which you may be familiar with. The Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976 is some people say it's a 2-year period. Some people say it's a 10-year period. We'll go with the 10-year period. It's 10 years in which basically society comes to a full halt and is mobilized against each other, against itself. Nevertheless, despite all of this chaos and violence, in the early 1970s, birth planning measures are really ramping up. So in the early, I think it's 71, the later, longer, fewer policy is introduced. Later, longer, fewer means waiting later to have a kid, waiting longer between births, and just having fewer children altogether. China historically and today loves slogans. So basically all of Chinese history, modern Chinese history, can be embodied or can be understood through slogans. So the late 1970s, the later, longer, fewer policy is replaced with a 1 at best, 2 at most policy. So 1 child at best, 2 at most, don't go any more over that.
And this is after the death of Mao Zedong in 1976. So there's a new leadership in China at the moment?
So all of actually that I googled this topic last night just to see what I would find, and according to Google, the first result that pops up, there was no systematic birth planning until the death of Mao Zedong in 1976. That's absolutely not true. As of the early 1970s, things are already becoming much more systematized. There's a system of birth planning penalties and rewards is introduced. So couples seeking to have a child have to get explicit authorization from their work unit. If they have a child that's unauthorized, the child won't have access to basic social services like health care, a residence permit, which is all movement at this time in China is highly restricted. And so not having access to a residence permit means a child can't go to school and can't get any of the things that the children need. There's also, conversely, there's a system of rewards. So people who do stick to that one child limit get like little prizes and little certificates that say, I only had 1 child and I practiced birth control for 20 years. Look at me. And you can put that on the wall in your office or something like that. But this is already in place and kind of ramping up before Mao's death. And it just kind of continues and becomes increasingly systematic after his death. So in 1979, the 1-child policy is famously introduced. And of course, as the name suggests, there's 1 child per family. But it's actually a bit of a misnomer, and it's actually among people who care about these things, it's typically referred to as a 1.5 child policy. So in 1984, just a few years after the implementation of the one child policy, there was widespread rural resistance to the policy. And so to prevent utter chaos from breaking out or further chaos, the government decided to introduce in 1984 some exceptions to the policy. So after 1984, only about a third of China remained under the original one-child policy, which is how we get to the 1.5 child policy.
So this is basically a policy that's affecting largely urban communities at this point. And for context, in China at this moment, there's major economic reforms taking place, which is including actually the massive deregulation of the countryside. So would you put this in the context of that economic deregulation in the countryside?
Yeah, so there's a kind of classist understanding of people's motivations for wanting to have more children. The kind of Western assumption is that Chinese people wanted to have more children because they have these sort of primitive demographic patterns, and they favor male children over female children because female children or girls are not valued. I mean, there is an aspect of that, but the reality is with the dismantling of the commune system in the late 70s and 80s, having children to perform labor on a farm becomes increasingly important. During this period, there's a new system of how people are getting paid, essentially, that's being developed. And you need to have more able-bodied people and typically men to do that type of labor. So rural families become quite upset when they're only limited to one child, and sometimes that one child is a girl. And the government responds to this by saying rural families can have a second child if the first is a girl. And the way that policy works in the PRC is there's a kind of a general policy that's implemented at the national level, and then local authorities implement it kind of as they see fit. So there's a huge amount of variation. If you were to read the news, one would get the impression that China is just all totalitarian, all-encompassing. There's no control, no individual agency whatsoever. But the reality is a lot more complicated.
For example, amongst the national minorities in China, there were exceptions to this amongst the Uyghurs, Tibetans, and other groups during the 80s and 90s. So this was not a uniform policy, and China is perhaps not as centralized as the Western imagination has.
Exactly. So rural families could have a second child if the first was a girl. Urban families could have a second child if the first was disabled or didn't meet certain qualifications. Ethnic minorities could have 2 children in urban areas and 3 in rural areas. And some provinces even allowed non-minorities, so the ethnic majority group, Han people, to have 3 children if they met certain conditions. So there really are a ton of caveats to this so-called one-child policy. One of the things that's kind of interesting is that ethnic minorities, when I first started visiting China in the early 2000s, ethnic minorities were perceived as having an advantage because they could have these additional children. And I remember having students say, I resent my classmates who are Uyghur or Tibetan because they have so many kids in their family. It must be so nice to be an ethnic minority. And that's a very simplistic generalization. Ethnic minorities face a tremendous amount of discrimination in many other facets of life. But it is interesting that the national government kind of foresaw that this was going to be an area that was going to cause a lot of resistance. And so it adapted the policy given those conditions.
In your book, you describe as these one-child policies sort of start to reform or fall away, there's more and more of an emphasis on quality childbirth. Could you talk more about the state eugenics program in that sense?
Yeah. So one of the things I find to be most interesting about this topic is eugenics is kind of like a dirty taboo word in the West. often, like in my classroom, students are completely caught off guard when I say in the late 19th century and early 20th century, everybody supported eugenics.
That's true. And not just white people. There was a black eugenics movement.
There's black eugenics, there's Asian eugenics, there's intra-Asian eugenics, there's Latin American eugenics, and there's many different like subsets of eugenic thought. And that's no different. China is very much a part of that global conversation. But now, today, eugenics is mostly synonymous with the Holocaust. And so the Holocaust is seen as like this exception, like eugenics went too far. We've proven that eugenics is bad. Now let's get rid of it. But the reality is the Holocaust was very much in line with the thinking of the day. What I guess is most interesting, though, is in the West now we've changed the rhetoric. We don't say, "Oh, I support eugenics" anymore. We say, "I support like family planning among certain communities for various reasons that are highly political." In China, however, it's totally fine to say you support eugenics, and I don't know, maybe it's just more straightforward. I don't know if it's better or worse, but I do recall visiting family planning clinics in the last few years when I was writing my book, and I was really surprised that there's just banners on the walls that say, "We support eugenics, better moms produce better babies," and they have pictures of like these smiling, ruddy-faced, pudgy children.
But would you say the word eugenics in Chinese has a different resonance?
It translates literally "yosheng" as superior births. And there has been plenty of debate over if that's a accurate translation or not. I think eugenics, it's a little bit complicated because on the one hand, what's wrapped into eugenics are things that I think most Americans would support, like having prenatal care, having access to a doctor, having regular checkups. Those are things we don't think of as being eugenic, but the goal is so-called superior births, because if you're not having those things, chances are you're not going to detect issues early on. However, there are other things that are more like more obviously problematic. The fact, for example, that people with a range of disabilities or health conditions are banned from having children and banned from getting married. And in the past, there were kind of like in the U.S., there was some support for forced sterilization of people with various types of disabilities that we now know cannot be passed down to your children, like bad eyesight or something. I mean, maybe you could pass that down, but it's also possible your child won't have bad eyesight. Should you be banned from having children? Probably not. So eugenics encompasses a wide range of measures that some are more problematic than others.
As we noted at the top, China abolished the one-child policy in 2015. What explains this reversal? So
the one-child policy has proven to have a lot of long-term consequences that are extremely negative. The policy almost went too far in the other direction, and now China is, for the first time since that period of widespread famine, there's actually a declining birth rate, and the absolute number of the population has decreased, which is something nobody really imagined would happen this quickly. So what does this declining birth rate mean? It means that there's not enough people to go into the workforce. If you think of the types of products that are produced in China, they're all labor intensive and they rely on cheap labor. If you don't have enough people, then you certainly don't have enough people who are willing to sacrifice themselves for those types of jobs. So it's essential for China's economic growth and stability to increase the workforce. Also, now the demographic structure is very lopsided. There are many, many more older people than young people able to take care of them. So something like tens of millions of people are going into retirement, and they're not being replaced.
And they retire earlier in China than in the United States, I believe in their 50s.
Yeah, so women are required to retire at 50, I believe, and men at 55, but I think that was increased to 60 recently, and that's kind of part of this global conversation about what to do with the growing number of retirees. As there was that conversation in France just recently about what do we do about changes to retirement conditions. So there's those issues, but I think most Chinese policy is thought of in terms of social and economic stability. And so the Chinese Communist Party for the last 4 decades has been, it's the entire source of its legitimacy is the ability to make people wealthy and comfortable. So maybe they don't have the political freedoms that they might otherwise want, but at least they can have nice cars and go send their kids abroad to study and things like that. But if the promise of economic stability and therefore social stability goes away, the Communist Party is going to really lose any validity in the eyes of the average person. So I think that's one of the main underlying factors here.
Speaking of demographic shifts, in your book you identify a trend in the birth ratio between boys and girls, with some regions seeing as much as 1.5 times as many boys born as girls. Can you talk a little bit about the social ramifications of that kind of gender disparity?
Yeah, so there's ostensibly at least 30 million additional men in China than women. And this is a problem not just in China, but in many parts of Asia. Anyway, so with the adoption of the one-child policy, the traditional preference for boys was exacerbated, and now families are only allowed to have one child, and of course they're going to want to have their son to carry on the family line. Then there's this compounding issue of rural, the dismantling of the commune system, which makes sons more valuable as farmhands. All together, this has this effect of making having a daughter extremely undesirable for some people. And so we see in the 80s and 90s mounting rates of gendercide, of female infanticide. I think it's in the mid-1980s that having prenatal ultrasounds that can detect the sex of the baby becomes pretty widespread. It's illegal, but that doesn't mean that people, for a very low fee, a mother could go to a doctor, find out the sex of the baby, and then if it's not what she wants, she could have it aborted.
And at this moment in the 80s and 90s, the health system in China is largely a private system?
No, well, at this point, it's public and private. It's becoming increasingly privatized. Today, it's quite private. But at that point, there would have been two kind of parallel systems: the public system and the private system, and then a kind of underground system as well. And I think a lot of this is taking place in the unofficial space, where for a small fee you can detect the sex of the baby, and then couples can decide, is this really what we want to do? And some studies have shown, surprisingly, there's an assumption that only rural people would want to terminate pregnancies if it's a boy, because, urban people are thought to be cultured and cosmopolitan and whatnot. But what this fascinating study showed was it was actually mostly urban people who were terminating their girl babies. First of all, they have tighter restrictions on for childbearing, but also it was kind of a status symbol to have a son. So urban people who have more disposable income might be more willing to spend that money to make sure that they have a son to carry on the family name.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mellors-Rodriguez. You've been listening to Talking History on KSMU, brought to you in association with Missouri State University Department of History. And if you'd like to hear more from our conversation with Dr. Mellors-Rodriguez, please check out our podcast, Talking History Extra, at ksmu.org. Welcome back to Talking History Extra. My name is Djene Vagelan.
And I'm Patrick Needham.
And we're going to be continuing our conversation with Dr. Sarah Mellors-Rodriguez about the one-child policy, birth control, family planning in China, and its ramifications.
How did these policies, known as collectively as the one-child policy, affect Chinese society and especially Chinese women?
That's a really important question. So even in the lead up to the one-child policy, so starting in the 1950s and then continuing through to the present, there's been a substantial amount of attention to women's bodies, a disproportionate amount of attention to women's bodies, and policing of women's sexuality. So many Americans would be shocked to hear that there is menstrual tracking in China to make sure that women are having their periods when they're supposed to, when they're not authorized to have children. There's mandatory IUD insertion, or there was up until recently, after the birth of a first child, and mandatory sterilization after the birth of a second. In some cases, there would have been, the mother would have been giving birth, and in the same sitting, she would have been sterilized. So she gives birth and is sterilized on the spot. As I was saying earlier, there is a lot of variation in policy enforcement, and that's one of the things that I found in my book was that depending on the time period and the location and the age of the people and their particular circumstances, there wouldn't necessarily have been forced sterilization. However, on the whole, there is just an enormous amount of very invasive policies that are primarily focused on women. There's also a lot of violence and trauma. If you think about being constantly monitored, being X-rayed to make sure that you haven't taken your IUD out, because self-removal of IUDs, though it was illegal, was a common issue. There's also famously, as Americans famously know, there were cases of forced abortion and cases of unauthorized pregnancies. Now, there's, again, a lot of variation in implementation of forced abortions, but it's well documented that there were many late-term forced abortions of unauthorized children. In my own research, though, I conducting oral histories or interviews with people who lived through this time period, I actually did not find anybody who had been forced to abort a pregnancy, because often local officials, depending on the time frame, were actually sympathetic to women's needs, or more like sympathetic to their husbands' needs and desire to have more children. And so they would say, okay, we're not going to force you to abort, but we are going to give you heavy fines that you need to pay off. And those could be really oppressive, prohibitive fines. But in some cases, local officials would even say, okay, we'll give you like a decade to pay off those fines, because they were sympathetic to the kind of conditions or the realities of life. Other impacts of the one-child policy, other than this skewed demographic structure with far too many older people with no one to care for them, then there's the issue of the skewed sex ratio. So now we have 30 million plus men who will never be able to get married, at least if they're heterosexual, will never be able to find a partner. China was known for having basically universal marriage rates, but that's changing due to a variety of different factors. But one of them is the fact that discrimination against women, or sexism, is so prevalent. A lot of women would rather focus on their own careers and their own personal advancement, and they don't want to settle for the type of guy who's probably very poor, is probably a migrant worker, and is probably one of these 30 million extra men. So there's a lot of competition to get a woman. There's also an additional issue of intense pressure on only children. So some Americans probably can relate to this. If you grew up as an only child, there's your parents' hopes and dreams you're the representation of all of those things. So that can be, on the one hand, that means that one child gets all the resources and all the love and attention and all of the money and education and what have you. On the other hand, if that child, for whatever reason, doesn't do well academically or has some other issue, this can be really emotionally detrimental for the child and for the family. And studies have shown that these children born into one-child families do have a lot of anxiety and a lot of just the the weight of being your family's only hope, and in some cases you're your grandparents' only hope too, because of the skewed demographic structure. So you have your 4 grandparents and the 2 parents all looking to this one child to be their future. Then there's another instance where if you have a one-child family and the one child passes away, now there are, or there were under the one-child policy, conditions or caveats that allowed for a family in that circumstance to have another child. But if you imagine you have a 25-year-old child who passes away, the parents are going to often be far too old to reproduce again. And that means that there's no one to care for either the parents or the 4 grandparents in old age. And that creates a variety of different problems that the Chinese government has not sufficiently addressed.
I mean, just to focus on that, in the West, as we spoke about in the main show, there is discussions about retirement ages and aging populations in general, especially in Western countries. And of course, China has the same issues that we're facing in the West. Now, I'm assuming, just like in many Western countries, historically, the care of the elders would fall on the children. What is happening now with old people, as there will be old people who do not have people to look after them in old age? There's this very strong Chinese family tradition, and that to a certain extent is going to be broken by the fact that certain families don't have heirs. Is the state in China taking any measures to deal with these old people who are going to not have family to look after them? What kind of social safety net exists for old people in China? I mean, we noted earlier that the retirement age is 50, which is extraordinary in many ways. But what if you don't have anyone to look after you or to help you out? How's China going to deal with this demographic bomb? Because we're facing this in other countries in the world, and things aren't going great in places like France. What's the big question? How is this being framed in China?
So this is a topic that I'm increasingly interested in conducting the research that I did for my book. I ended up interviewing a lot of senior citizens, and getting to know them, I got to get a better sense of the types of challenges they were facing on a day-to-day basis and as a broader demographic. So in terms of families with no heir, actually since the 1950s, there have been some programs that are meant to help take care of those older people who don't have somebody to care for them, but they're extremely limited and they have been very sporadic. It was already evident 2 decades ago that this was going to happen, but it's become much more urgent in recent years. And so what started as sort of the Chinese government is thinking we need to address the needs of these older people, but are we going to do it, is becoming now a major issue. There's going to be launching of pilot programs to help care for the elderly. But one of the really annoying and unfortunate uses of history that we can see in relation to care for the elderly, people in the West often will say, oh, but Chinese people have, Confucian values. They respect their elders. They care for their parents. And while that was true in ancient times, and it's true to an extent today, the Chinese government will often try to take advantage of that language to force people who are already barely keeping it together, barely making ends meet, to shoulder the burden of caring for their own parents. So it will say, you can see propaganda slogans on the streets saying, care for your mother, care for your grandmother, call your grandmother and make sure she's healthy. I mean, all of those things are good, but it's basically saying the government isn't going to shoulder the burden of caring for a lot of impoverished older people, many of whom have disabilities. And it's part of our intrinsic Chinese culture, is the language, that individual families should support the elderly. There's another issue that's a little bit specific to Chinese culture, there's a general stigma surrounding putting elderly people in old age homes. And old age homes I'm actually working or trying to work on the history of old age homes since 1949 in China, and I'm finding it's very easy to chronicle this history since there were only a handful of them. The vast majority of old age care takes place within the home, or having people within the community shouldering that burden. But now it's become clear that there's increasing numbers of elderly people, particularly in rural areas where there's very limited health care, there's a limited social safety net, and often there's not even that many young people. The young people have gone off to the cities to be migrant workers and things like that. So you have all these old people who are living on pennies a day because the stipend they get from the government is very, very limited, and it's really tragic.
Your book covers not only the communist period 1949 to the present, but also the Republican period that began in 1911 with the overthrow of the Qing dynasty and the birth of the Chinese Republic. Can you tell us a little bit about the debates on population growth and birth control in China during that period?
Sure. So if you think about the kinds of conversations that people were having around the world at this time, in the 20s and 30s, in the lead up to the Depression, there's actually a lot of resonances with what's going on in China. So in other parts of the world, in Europe, in North America, in Japan, which is particularly influential on China at this time, there's this vast community of people talking about the roles of women. So if we think of like the flapper is part of a global trend of female modernity. What do we do with the women question? Women want to work, women want rights. What do we do? So that's a conversation that's happening within China at the same time as people are increasingly being exposed to eugenics, which is brought to the language of eugenics. There's a kind of an ancient form of intrinsically sort of Chinese eugenics, and then it's fused with the global story of eugenics. So in the late 19th century, early 20th century, Japan is extremely influential in China, and Japanese scholars bring the idea of these superior births to China. And if we kind of think more broadly about Chinese history, so 1911, the last Chinese dynasty falls. There's been this dynastic cycle for millennia, depending on who you ask. But this causes this enormous historical disruption. Suddenly there's no more emperor, and China is struggling to modernize. For a little background, in the mid-19th century, foreign powers, namely the British and later other representatives of other countries, forced China into these unequal trade relationships. And there's also domestic unrest as well. All of these things make people call into question the validity of Chinese culture. So in the 20s and 30s, Chinese elites are very much in the midst of this question of how to save the nation. They have what's known as the May 4th movement, where they're questioning Confucian values. They're questioning, how did we get here? How did we end up as a semi-colonized nation where British people were able to just blow open our doors with gunboats? So in that context, some people look to eugenics as the answer, and they say that they could embrace negative eugenics, so they could negative eugenics is the camp of eugenics that involves limiting some people from reproducing. So some people say, okay, we need to prevent the so-called undesirables, so people with illnesses, the poor, people who are homeless, people who are prostitutes, from having children.
And this is, just to be clear, this is a discourse that's not just taking place in China, but this is, the height of the progressive era in the United States is also the height of eugenics and progressivism, i.e. the idea that we're going to challenge some of the long-held cultural assumptions we had, often went hand in hand with eugenics, which was seen as a vector of modernization.
Exactly. And many of these ideas, there's clear parallels with the kinds of things that people are endorsing in, let's say, Britain or the United States. There's an entire very powerful contingent of people who believes that ethnic minorities and the poor should be sterilized in this country, and in some places that actually becomes the law. And interestingly, Chinese elites look to the United States and they see that Americans are sterilizing their so-called undesirables, and they say, that's one particular model for modernity or for modernizing. And they explicitly reference, the United States is doing it and they're powerful, so maybe this is what we should be doing. So some people look to negative eugenics, others look to positive eugenics, which is the kind of corollary to negative eugenics, which basically says that these so-called superior people, middle class, educated, not in China, but people of a superior ethnic background should be encouraged to have more children and therefore forbidden from using birth control, because if they have access to birth control, only the undesirables will reproduce, not the educated people. So quite a few people endorse both of these lines of thinking. They also see contraception as a way to deal with other social ills. So the issue of dangerous abortions, which is a global issue, of back alley abortions, child abandonment and infanticide. Like I mentioned earlier, infanticide, for whatever reason, is largely associated with China, but other scholars have shown that actually China's infanticide rate was consistent with that in Europe and other parts of the world. So this is not a Chinese thing. It's just a racist, like Orientalist idea that only Chinese people committed infanticide. Some people wanted specifically to ease the burdens of poor women, and so they linked this war on population growth with empowering women. But at least in my research and in China, this was generally, the focus was rarely women, and the people participating in the conversation, the kind of national dialogue, were also rarely women. Sometimes they were even men pretending to be women who would write advice columns and things like this, and they pretended to be women to gain legitimacy.
So the question of family planning, birth control, eugenics during the early Republican period in China was driven less by the women's movement per se and more by this question of national development and the role of women in national development and how, in a sense, China was going to create modern mothers of the nation.
Exactly. And in the United States, like, I have served on panels and in various conferences and conversations with people who study the United States, and abortion and birth control are almost exclusively framed in terms of like women's emancipation, individual rights, liberal feminism, liberal white feminism. But really, almost none of those things come into play, or at least not in any significant way in the Chinese conversation. And this is something that's remained consistent. So I was talking about the 20s and 30s, but if you look at the national conversation about birth control and abortion in China today, it's very, very much aligned with what it was 100 years ago. Women's bodies are always a tool of the nation, and birth control is a means to an end, a means to increase economic productivity. So whether a woman is empowered or not is kind of a moot point.
And as we saw in the case of Indira Gandhi in India, it can be a woman leader who is implementing a fairly draconian birth control measures, although I believe directed against men, sterilizing men in return for a transistor radio.
So Indira Gandhi is best known for what's called the emergency in the 1970s, where she led these crackdowns on forced, or not crackdowns, but she forced large numbers of men to be given vasectomies. And this is very much in dialogue with the types of stuff that's going on in China at this time, except for the focus in China is typically on women, not men. After the emergency, after Indira Gandhi made all of these men unable to reproduce, she quickly went out of style, and so did her methodology, and instead the focus shifts back to women. So then after the 1970s, now India, when it's focusing on whose bodies to monitor and police, it's going to be women, because the emergency basically tarnished the reputation of vasectomies.
So how did these debates around reproduction change after the 1949 revolution, and to what extent did the revolution itself affect those debates?
So after 1949, now everything is supposed to be seen through the lens of socialism. And according to people who are really invested in socialist thought, Karl Marx actually said that overpopulation is something that's unique to the capitalist mode of production. So in capitalist societies, you have an uneven social safety net. You have unemployment, you have lack of access to healthcare and housing and things like that. But according to Marx, under socialism, because there's universal healthcare, housing, employment, etc., you can never have too many people because the state can always support more people. So it's this line of thinking that, among other things, that makes birth control seem unnecessary. And so there's, after 1949 and into the early 1950s, access to birth control and abortion become very limited. The policy, like I mentioned, this policy of not giving access to family planning goes out of style after the 1953 census reveals that there's unprecedented population growth. But there's also the influence of the Soviet Union.
Well, this is what I wanted to ask. This is actually kind of a fascinating question, because in 1917, when the Bolsheviks took power, especially under the influence of figures such as Alexandra Kollontai and, important socialist feminists, the initial impetus of the Bolshevik Party was to legalize abortion, make birth control readily available, and legalize other issues, other things that had been forbidden, like homosexuality, etc., etc. So there was a kind of very liberal approach to what we might think of as a liberal approach to birth control, family planning, gender relations in the early phase of the Soviet Union. Now that gets reversed by the Stalinist era. So it's kind of interesting that we see within the global socialist movement in the post-Stalinist era a decisive shift towards a kind of social conservatism. We often think of the left in America as being socially liberal, socially radical, but the quote-unquote traditional Marxist-Leninists are actually, since the 1930s, have been quite socially conservative vis-a-vis questions of gender relations and birth control.
That's exactly right. In the kind of honeymoon period of the Bolshevik Revolution, there was a real emphasis on modernizing gender roles and empowering women, and abortion was legalized. But when Stalin came to power, he basically reversed all of those things. And we can see that based on the timeline. So in 1949, China is kind of cherry picking from Soviet history, which things it wants to follow. In 1955, the Soviet Union again legalizes abortion, and so that makes it okay for China to also legalize abortion. So these issues of food shortages, people not being very healthy, high levels of child mortality, all of these other things, in conjunction with the fact that the Soviet Union is now shifting away from its conservatism, it all kind of sets the stage for China to encourage birth control and birth planning. But yeah, all of this is within the context of the nation, and so rarely framed in terms of helping individuals or empowering particular groups like women.
So there's a kind of continuity then between the Republican era and the Communist era in China, which speaks to the internalization of the framework of national development, even amongst communists who are supposed to reject the nation as a sort of vehicle for modernization and focus on class. But in many ways, the communist regime in China is successful less as a communist regime, but more as a nationalist regime that is able to do what the Chinese Republic had not been able to do, establish its sovereignty and establish a framework for development and implement a lot of those policies that were discussed during this early period, during the Republican period, but couldn't be implemented because of Chinese political fragmentation, the invasion by Japan. And it was only with the communists, ironically, that the path to national development could be undertaken, and this huge project of demographic engineering, which is by no means unique to China, but this big project of demographic engineering could take place. So in a kind of weird way, the Chinese communists are better nationalists than the Chinese nationalists.
And I think quite a few scholars have argued that, although I think it's still up for debate. But you're exactly right in that there is no the communists aren't rejecting the state; they're empowering the state, and we see that these lines of continuity, which I guess as a historian that's what we look for. But I think it's most interesting to see that the same kinds of debates, and even some of the same people were having debates in the 1920s and then participating in the same debates in the 1970s in the making of this one-child policy. And it's more complicated than that, because we can see that some of those people who were voicing concerns about population growth were punished and silenced and purged in various Maoist political movements. But ultimately, the kind of the boundaries of the conversation continue to be similar.
So as a kind of final question to sort of cap off this conversation, what do you think generally debates around birth control tell us about the question of modernization, and what kind of misconceptions do you think people in the general public have about the question of birth control, family planning, perhaps in China, but also more generally?
Well, it's clear from looking at world history that controlling one population, whether it's to grow the population or to shrink it or to optimize it in certain ways, is like part and parcel of modernity. So no matter what corner of the globe you go to, you will see that regimes that are trying to modernize, that are trying to build a stronger state, are highly concerned with public health, and they're highly concerned with who's reproducing and under what circumstances. So I would argue that the idea of population as something, well, Foucault argued this, and I would also argue it, that conceptualizing the population as a particular entity and being worried about whether it's growing or shrinking, and whether it's wealthy who are reproducing or it's white people or black people or what have you. This is all part and parcel of modernizing. And you can look anywhere in the world and there's going to be some kind of top-down efforts to regulate or at least think about controlling the trajectory of population growth.
And to wrap this up, we would like to ask you what the most interesting 3 books that you would suggest, recommend on the topic of China.
So for regular people who don't want to read long, dense, arguably boring academic books, I love those. You can read mine. It's long, boring, dense, and academic. I would recommend some kind of lighter books for more generalist audiences that are just fun and memorable. One is The Age of Ambition, Chasing Fortune, Truth, and Faith in the New China by Evan Osnos, which gives a sweeping history of modern China, but with a lot of vivid details and anecdotes. Something similar is Country Driving, A Journey Through China from Farm to Factory by Peter Hessler, who talks about getting his driver's license in China and all of the fascinating things that entails, because at the point when he's writing in the 2000s or 2010s, China has the largest growing population of new drivers, and this causes, you can imagine, it leads to a lot of...
Well, the DMV in Springfield has its own issues, but I can't imagine what a DMV in China looks like.
I mean, he tells this in great detail, and it's so funny, so funny. The last book I'd recommend is by Peter Hessler's wife, or maybe Peter Hessler is Leslie Chang's husband, is a better framing. Factory Girls from Village to City in a Changing China. And Leslie Chang she does tons of interviews with young migrant workers who are mostly women, who are the people in the south of China making all of your clothes and doodads and phones and things like that we all rely so heavily on. And she gives a really poignant portrait of what it looks like to actually be one of those people working in those factories and the kinds of challenges they deal with, and also the humor and joy they manage to find in what could be a pretty depressing situation. So I recommend those 3 books. If you're not looking for something so light, you could also look at something I think is very powerful and poignant is Cultural Revolution memoirs. Are absolutely eye-opening, and they're written in such a powerful way. Even if you don't know Mandarin, they have been translated beautifully. And if you just Google Cultural Revolution memoirs, you will come up with a wide variety of things that will shed really important light on different types of themes in Chinese history and global history.
Well, thank you so much again for coming to talk to us on Talking History. And we hope to have you back again in the future to talk more about China, because I know there are many other topics that we can cover again in the future.
Thank you so much for having me.
Talking History is a collaboration between KSMU and the Missouri State Department of History. Thanks for listening.